Hi, this is Mike Benoit of Tyranny Busters. This video is a proof of a proof from Stefan Molyneux, or a disproof of his proof, and try and clear up the confusion between government, society, and the state. Three distinct, separate things. Of course, government is a tool used by society or used by the state. And we'll get into Stefan Molyneux's video here first. We'll do a little screen share. Let's see if I can remember how to do that. Find it here and go. All right.
Free Domain Radio, I hope that you're doing well. This is a little presentation entitled The Proof for Anarchy. It's sort of embarrassing how long it took me to come up with this as a thesis, but we will look on the bright side and hope that it holds or stands. This is more details from an argument in the free book, Everyday Anarchy, available at freedomainradio.com in ebook or audiobook format. So, anarchy, the proof. Well, there's a core anarchist claim, or the core anarchist claim, is that a central coercive monopoly, a state, a government, is not required for criminal sanctions, punishment of criminals, violent crime, and so on, for the provision of public goods, roads, and pollution controls, and so on, and for contract enforcement. Furthermore, using a state to solve these problems is both counterproductive and immoral.
All right, so that's a claim that I concur with 100%. A state is not necessary for those things.
Now, fairly simple argument. Why has it made so little headroads or headway among educated and civilized debaters? Well, there's a real challenge. Two main challenges, I would say. When you attempt to convince people of the validity of a stateless society, what happens is you kind of have to go one of two routes. And the first route is you say, well, there are historical examples of a stateless society, but they don't tend to get very far with people. People don't really know much about them. It requires a lot of research. The research can be biased by people's political opinions, either pro or con. It seems very distant and vaguely not credible because they've never heard about it before. So that doesn't generally tend to clinch the case. And the second, of course, is to provide theoretical models of how public services could be provided without a government, of how law courts could work without a government.
So this is where he starts convoluting and conflating the state with government. And he refers to them as the same thing. Now, anarchists are always arguing for private government, if you will, DROs and other things, but they're still arguing for government. And so the distinction has to be made between what is a state and what is a government. And of course, a government is something by consent. I saw an interesting post regarding a libertarian in Florida who was the chair of the Florida Libertarian Party, and he resigned because he wanted to make a public statement against some particular candidate that was running for office under the libertarian banner, and he was restricted from making that statement as the chair of the or being the chair. He couldn't make a statement for himself. Now that's it. That's how a government moves into a state, because it mandates a principle or a policy on somebody that violates his personal moral code, and it is no longer a government by consent, but it becomes a state. And here he refers to those two things as being the same thing, a state and government being the same thing, and they are not. This goes back to Thomas Jefferson and explaining that society and government are not the same thing. Well, you have three different things here. The government, think of it as the tool. The state as a employer of the tool without your consent, and society employing the tool with consent.
And so on. And what this does is it tends to provoke the endless, yeah, but problem of endless questioning. Well, you might not need this, but what about this? And how would this work? And how would that work? And the other, and what if, and what if? And that doesn't tend to clinch or close the case either. So These have been the typical weapons in the anarchist arsenal, so to speak, but they have not been effective for the reasons that I mentioned. So the historical examples people bring up, well, a couple hundred years of medieval Iceland, there was medieval Ireland, feudal Europe, as some people say is a decent example, anarchic communes during the Spanish Civil War. Rothbard talks a lot about Pennsylvania, 17th century, modern Somalia, kibbutzim in Israel, and so on.
Okay, so here he's talking about societies that do not have a state, but they certainly have government. And the American Indians had government. They didn't have a state, but they had government. What is the state? And what is anarchy truly? Anarchy would be truly the absence of a ruler. Okay, so a government by consent wouldn't have a ruler demanding what you do and you don't do. That's the state that does that. And so when you argue against the state, that's one thing. When you argue against government, that's another thing. And these things that he just mentioned are, in fact, did in fact have governments, but not a state.
But these aren't terribly convincing. And there's very few people who are going to be saying we should run our society according to the principles that were enacted in medieval Iceland. It doesn't tend to be very, very convincing. It requires a lot of research and doesn't tend to get over the hump. These are distant examples, or you don't know much about them. They seem inapplicable. They seem foreign. And in the example of Iceland and Ireland and feudal Europe, they were ended by statist intervention, either domestically or from other countries. Requires a lot of research. It's just not terribly convincing, and we can see the results of the general acceptability of anarchistic theories, that it doesn't really come about, that these things don't really work. So the holy grail of anarchic argument is, what if there were an example of political anarchism that was in practice, that every reasonably educated adult was perfectly aware of and understood deeply?
Well, actually, he doesn't go into covering that until the end of this video. He goes into other stuff, talking about things that would work in an anarchist society, like defense, what do they call them? Defense organizations, something like that, DROs. But he's going to show later on an example how there's anarchy within the government itself, the state, not the government, but the state. And of course, there's anarchy going on all the time within society, even though the state's over there, looming over there, going to want to come down and crash on you. Anytime somebody engages in, let's say, a contract like, hey, Joe, will you come over and replace my water heater? Yeah, sure. $250 and I'll do it. So Joe comes over, replaces the water heater, gets $250. There's no state involved. It doesn't pay sales tax and rackety rack. He just does the job. Of course, so that is what you would call an anarchic transaction. He's going to show how these anarchy transactions would concur in the state. He's going to show that later on, how it happens in the state. And of course, anarchy is happening all the time in society. And even under anarchy, there's government happening. When Joe made the agreement, they have a verbal contract, and they might have different ways of enforcing it. It might not have the state involved in enforcing it, but they still have government governing their actions. And they know that if Joe doesn't get paid, Joe's going to, take it upon himself and get some consequences laid on the guy that, contracted with Joe to do the work.
If we could use that example to prove that anarchism worked, not could work, not might work, not worked in ancient Ireland or worked in some future theoretical thing, or doesn't work in Somalia.
Okay, so we do know that anarchy works, because when you talk about anarchy working in the sense of no government, then of course that's an impossibility. But if you talk about anarchy working in the sense of no state, that's absolutely what it does. And it's happening all the time. And anarchy is just people that are society engaging in consensual activities without a ruler, without a master, telling them what they can and can't do. and they govern those actions one way or another. So that is anarchy working. Now, do I call myself an anarchist? No, because the anarchists go out there and they're arguing against government, which is just totally an irrational, illogical concept. Now, if the anarchists keep it to let's argue against the state, because the state is our enemy, I'm with you. Let's go. Let's do it. But to keep convoluting government with the state is a mistake.
Because of state funding and state intervention, arms sales, and so on, the irrational society and so on, at least we would overcome a core argument against anarchy, which is that it is functionally impractical. Does such an example exist? Oh yeah. All I can say is positively, frequently. But first, because I'm very keen on creating as many barriers to acceptance of the truth as possible, let's create the most difficult conceivable or possible case for anarchy. Because a theory which operates very well under the most adverse conditions can be assumed to operate even better under less adverse or less extreme conditions. So if a man can lift 100 pounds, it's perfectly valid and an entire...
I don't know. This where he just gets off into going off on, I don't know what, because he's really lost the track early on anyways when he conflates government with the state and saying they're the same thing. And maybe for me to hit this point a little bit more, a family has government. A church has government. I don't want to go to government school or the state-run school, but public or a private school has government. Businesses have government. They govern the actions. If you have a meeting and you use Robert's Rules of Order, you have government. Okay? The state, being a different thing, the state takes power away from personal government or church government or corporation government or company government, and it takes that power away from you and uses it actually against your will. It mandates and prohibits actions for you to be able to carry on to do stuff that you have a natural right to do. So there's the difference. And he's going to go into talking about these DROs, and which is fine. Things done by consent are fine, and governments done by consent are fine. It's the state that mandates, that rules, that prohibits. These things are not fine, and so we'll move on from that.
A true statement to say, yes, he can lift 5 pounds. The challenge. So a stateless society, the application of a stateless society faces the challenges of, how do you deal with, without a government, how do you deal with criminal prosecution, contract enforcement, the provision of public goods, roads, national defense, sewage, garbage collection, blah, 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 and so on.
All right, so I have to cover that again. Here he talks about the stateless society, and then he conflates it with a society without a government. Now, think about you've got a small, like the Old West towns, and the people decided that they're going to have a sheriff to enforce basic natural rights, the right to private property ownership, the right to your life, your liberty, and if somebody busts up your property, then the town hires a sheriff to deal with arresting that person, and then they might even have a judge pro tem, somebody in the community that has good common sense and is unbiased person that doesn't take it's not bigoted and doesn't take sides on issues without hearing all the facts. So and then that's your judge, and then 12 people get together and you have your jury, and then you're going to go into the trial and determine whether or not if Joe Smith murdered Jane Doe, and if so, what's the penalty? Well, there's no state involved there, but there is government, and so you got to stop conflating these two, or it's just a nonsensical argument.
Anarchist theorists do not say that these services are not required. Nobody says, we don't need roads. Roads are a fool's game. They're a con man's game. But rather that essential coercive agency is not required, not moral, and impractical in the long run. So the free domain
And that's what I'm saying too. But he keeps arguing and conflating the terms government and the state.
Radio solution, and this is just stuff that I've been working on for the last couple of years, of these things called DROs, or dispute resolution organizations. And these are like quasi-insurance companies that provide customers with things like contractual enforcement. And this is not necessarily if you're doing business with someone in Taiwan or Jupiter, but rather contractual enforcement.
Okay, so this is where he's proposing private government organizations to govern activities and to deal with issues and whatnot, and which is fine. And actually, that was what I just mentioned with the sheriff. That's a private hire by the community to hire a individual or person to enforce the natural laws that the community agrees to, and or not to necessarily enforce them, but to begin the enforcement and the apprehension of people who violate them, and to have a mechanism to deal with disputes. That's government, not the state. So he's proposing government here, and the form of DROs, dispute resolution organizations or whatnot. These are all things that would be fine, and we have them in our society right now. With people can go to arbitration panels to solve their dispute and their contracts and all of that. But the problem that makes it not so workable now is the state has volumes of laws, rules, and regulations that people have to adhere to. And so the state is sucking up the governmental power, the personal government of all of us, by prohibiting us from writing our own contracts and then dealing with the solution there at the the arbitration or dispute resolution or wherever you want it to be. And the central coercive power of government wouldn't exist if we had government itself doesn't do that. It's sort of like a free-flowing river that doesn't get stagnated, and you don't have a coercive power. You have different people that take the reins, so it's not any career opportunity like this the status in the political class that happens with a state. So again, the anarchists are blowing this argument by arguing against government in general when it's a naturally occurring thing, and conflating it with the state, which is a bastardization of government.
With issues you may have with your landlord or with your school or whatever. Protection from criminal victimization, collective defense if necessary, and the public goods argument does not require the existence of a state. It doesn't justify it. You can have roads without. In fact, roads were invented long before the state came along, and so on. So really, we're just going to focus on the contract.
So he talks about roads happening long before the state came along. All right. So is he arguing against that period of conditioning or condition that happened before the state came along too? Is he saying we shouldn't have government too? Or is his argument the state?
Actual enforcement, protection from criminals, and collective defense. So here's a totally minor example. This covers virtually nothing, but it's just a way of looking at it. If you and I enter into a business arrangement for $100,000, let's say, we can choose a mutually acceptable DRO to provide restitution if one of us fails to adhere to the contract. If I fail to adhere to the contract, the DRO will pay you for your relevant losses, and then we'll...
Okay, so here's the thing about the argument here. He's trying to argue against, this again is an argument against government and with a argument for government. And really his argument should be against the state and for government. And so, but he's in general arguing against government, which would be basically the same thing if you had, let's say, a judicial system that was based in government and not in the state. And of course, in the state is where they write all these rules and regulations that say this has to be, and they mandate everything, and you can't even voluntarily set the terms of your contract. And that's what we have now with the state. But if you didn't have all that nonsense, you take the state out of the picture, and just you're left with government and say, okay, we have this one in this community, we have a judge here, and the judge comes into play when you all can't take your dispute over there to your mediator or your arbitrator and solve it. And when you can't get it done there, then as a last resort, here we are. And you might like the results better with the mediator and the arbiter, because he might try to split the pie up equally, or try to get everybody happy, where the judge that says he's the final result, you might end up saying, hey, well, let's go back to where we can work it out and not go to the judge. So again, I'm not going to get into the rest of what he's talking about here, because he's gone down the road already where he's arguing against government and as if government is the same thing as the state. And it isn't. It is not. It is not. It is not. Okay? When we formed the United States of America, unfortunately, we had the seeds in there of a state planted. The Constitution tried to prevent that. This government by consent, by, limiting the power of that general government to very few and minor things. But over the centuries, the political class has usurped our personal power of government from us, sucked it up into Washington, and rules like a tyrant over our lives, controls and demands what we do, mandates it, controls the states, the individual states that were supposed to be governments and not states, controls them. So all your personal power has been sucked into your state capitals and Washington, D.C. And so the argument should be not arguing against government. You want self-government. You want government to get as close to you as possible. You want government to you want to be able to govern your community, your business, and all these other things. And but your argument should be against the state. And when anarchists stop arguing against government, which is something that we naturally do, and start arguing against the state, then I'll start calling myself an anarchist. But not until then, because I don't want you all to get confused and think I'm against government. Nope. I think you should self-govern. I think that your community should govern. I think your homeowners associations should govern. Your churches should govern. Your all your different organizations should govern, and your union should govern. Watch out! As soon as they start ruling and mandating, they become no longer a government, but they become a state. And what's the difference? A state is not by consent. All right, it's a tyranny. It's taking power where you have no right to take power. Government is by consent. And so that's enough of this Tyranny Busters video. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next go around. This has been Mike Benoit, Tyranny Busters. Let me know what you think of this video.